about health, and so I thought about ethical culture and health. Lorraine, be healthy. Come and grab a seat in the front. There are lots. This is from a study of Felix Adler's life by Horace Freese, who was Adler's son-in-law and was also chairman of the religion department at Columbia University, and a man I am very grateful to have met, although he was, quote, old and retired. He was a wonderful mentor when I was in training at the New York Society. And Horace writes, "The Ethical Culture Society began its deeds with two modest yet well-directed practical projects. A first proposal before the end of 1877, that was 1 year after the society was founded. A first proposal was to send nurses to visit the homebound sick in poor districts. A beginning was made with a single nurse, Miss Effie Benedict, a college graduate with training from Bellevue Hospital, the first public hospital in America, where our member Louis Goldfrank has just retired as chairman of the Department of Emergency Medicine. Miss Benedict was based at the DeMilt Dispensary, where at that time some of the best medical men, notice in those days, gave their services free. A careful routine was worked out, and the nurse reported on her visits to a doctor. He in turn instructed her, and when necessary, visited the sick with her." When was the last time any of us had a house call? This practice, at first called district and then visiting nursing, caught on readily and became eventually a vital adjunct in city health systems. It was one of the precursors of the visiting nurse service of America. The Ethical Culture Society was interested in its being a non-sectarian service, and it soon became permanently organized as such, largely through the work of Lillian D. Wald and the Henry Street Settlement. Lillian Wald was the founder of the Henry Street Settlement. I don't know whether she was a member of the New York Society, but she certainly was a friend of the Society. A wonderful piece of our history in terms of bringing health to people who otherwise, in the working class, urban, poor districts of New York City, would not have been able to get good health care. So thank you, Effie Benedict. Thank you, Lillian Wald, and thank you, Felix Adler. Let's take a couple of minutes to have Erica Jones speaking with us. Dr. Jones is an eminent physician, as her mother assures us regularly.
I'm sure.
However, there's plenty of biographical information in the program, so I'm not going to repeat that. I do want to echo something that Erica said, because in a recent article in The New Yorker, there is a reference to a 3-year study of 5,000 people's use of Facebook, just Facebook. After 3 years of study, self-reports indicate that Facebook users are less healthy physically, less healthy mentally, and less satisfied with life than non-Facebook users. Interesting reference. Now, I don't have the scholarly study in front of me, but we could find it. It's reported in the New Yorker recently. So let's control our devices. It is not a federal crime to shoot a computer. Erica is a local kid, raised in Montclair, Tarrytown, and now living in Bronxville. We can't get rid of her. She has 3 kids, from 24 to 17. And when I asked her what I could introduce her by that would be scandalous, outrageous, she couldn't think of anything. The only scandalous information is that Anne is her mother. And Shona is her sister. Erica, thanks for coming.
And that Anne probably doesn't know some of the scandalous things. That Shona does know. So would you prefer me to be near the...
Maggie, can you hear him back?
I have a pretty loud voice, so as long as everyone can hear. So thank you so much for having me. Much better. You want me to come back here? So I am what you could call as a preventative cardiologist now. I've been 25 years at Cornell and have done a lot of things there. The last of which in the last 5 years was running what's called Heart Health, which is a cardiovascular prevention program. So my interest is in people with risk, high-risk behaviors, and lipid disorders, so bad cholesterol. I do a lot of imaging. So you can go ahead to the first slide. And so one of the things I love is this slide that a friend of mine gave me, and I just always think about, like, do you really know what your risk of heart disease is? And quite honestly, most people don't, because the whole silent killer thing, you know, most people die of their heart attack actually before they have any symptoms. First symptom is a sudden death or a heart attack, unfortunately. And so this is my world of trying to find that healthy person, but whose parent maybe died or who has bad risk. Next slide, please. And so we think of the traditional risk factors. There's the non-modifiable, and then just hit the enter key one more time, hon. So, and then there's going to be the modifiable. So of the non-modifiable age, unfortunately, the men do get heart disease a little bit earlier than the women, but we all catch up, and then that family history. You can't run from your genes, as we say. But then these modifiable risk factors. Everybody in this room can fix these things in one way or another. Not perfectly, and there is clearly a genetic predisposition to high lipids, to depression, to diabetes, and to obesity. So, you know, they're modifiable to a degree, but, and believe me, skinny people have heart disease too. So it's not the only thing. So before you hit the next enter, well, I was just going to ask, so what do you guys think? So it's 90% of risk is actually taken care of by these modifiable risk factors. So yeah, yes, hon.
I don't think it's too early for the question.
No, not at all.
I see you've got high cholesterol
Yeah.
and everything. Diet.
We're getting into that. Don't you worry. So we're getting to all of this. Yes, hon.
Yeah, I see non-modifiable male sex. Does that mean female sex is modifiable?
No, it means that you can't, well, I guess maybe this isn't the appropriate thing to say, is that you cannot go from one to the other, but that's not really true anymore, is that men have a higher risk of heart disease than women up until about the age of 75. And then at about 75, we all catch up. But it's clear that menopause is, you know, what we don't suddenly become more male-like in our risk at menopause, but after menopause, women catch up. We lose our estrogens, and those are protective. So this talk, unfortunately, is not going to focus on diet, but it's more on stress, but we'll talk about it, okay? So that, go ahead, you can hit that, the 90% of what we can get rid of. Next slide. But the other thing that now I wanted to talk about is these are now what are sort of called the novel or the new or the non-traditional risk factors that not everybody thought about until maybe the last 10, 15 years. So chronic inflammatory disorders, arthritis, lupus, all these diseases that are more common in women, radiation therapy or chemotherapy for cancers in the chest, women who had pregnancy complications have a much higher risk of heart disease, HIV, probably, thankfully, because men with HIV are living longer, and also, though, that the medications and the virus itself is probably inflammatory. And then we're going to focus on these red ones down here. So this talk is really all sort of about stress and heart disease, and it's a tough one in my world because I work with a very, very data-driven field. You know, the good thing about medicine is it's peer-reviewed. You know, you really got to prove. And the problem is that the real researchers find this stuff soft. They're like, oh, sleep, who cares about sleep? You know, I keep hearing that. And yet, we just keep pushing it, and people are actually starting to realize that it is like a huge part of this problem. So we're going to talk about sort of social isolation, lack of a sense of purpose, anger, pessimism, burnout in people's careers, and it's a huge problem in medicine. Up until July, I ran the fellowship program at Cornell, and it's a big problem. Next slide, please. So essentially, when you look at, this is from the InterHeart study, which looked at about 33 different countries, hundreds of thousands of people, and they came up with these sort of 9 risk factors for heart disease. And look where stress is. I was actually shocked by this, that how high up they put stress. And this is in third world countries, it's in industrialized countries, so stress in different places is different to different people. And that's also been a part of the problem with dealing with stress, is what is stress? You know, people could say, I have a stressful life, I have 3 kids, I work 80 hours a week, I commute into the city, but I love what I do. So there's actually a lot more stress in people who actually have jobs that have no control. And so nurses actually have a lot of stress in their lives because they're sort of always being told what to do. Factory workers, things like that, where you're just sort of always set. So we'll keep going and just keep that in mind, that it's the third leading cause of, probably heart attacks in the world. Okay, next. So I liked this quote, Sir William Osler, right at the beginning of the century here. In the worry and strain of modern life, arterial degeneration is not only very common, but it develops at a relatively early age. For this, I believe the high pressure at which men, of course it's always men back then, live, and the habit of working the machine to its maximal are responsible. And this was really before a lot of the craziness we're dealing with now with devices and multitasking. So it was already starting to be understood that men who were under a tremendous amount of stress 100 years ago, 150 years ago, were actually dying young. Next, please.
What is the machine?
The body. You. Yes, yeah, so yeah. So what are related? So we do know that work and stress, I'm going to show you some studies that prove that work, stress, and burnout, lack of control, anger and hostility, and sleep deprivation. We're going to focus on those three just for lack of time to talk about the other things. Next, please. So in a human performance curve, we actually talk about this. A lot of these slides have come from talks that I've given to the fellowship program on how we can actually have our trainees be sort of as functional, and we want to sort of be in that optimal stress level. We all know it's actually horrible to be bored all day long, isn't it? You're at a job that just isn't satisfying you, and the day just completely drags. And then on the other side of it, where you literally feel like you can't function. And so where is that happy medium? And this has been a lot of stress in the academic world, is to try and figure out what is the optimal stress level for our trainees. We're not quite there yet. We're getting there, and it's better. And I have to say that some of the things that we've done, I actually think have not helped with stress. For example, keeping residents from staying up all night and getting to go home the next day. The residents hate it. They actually prefer to stay with their patients. The patients hate it because they get a new doctor overnight, and the number of mistakes is actually about the same as it was when people were sleep deprived. So the handoff is probably as dangerous as fatigue. So there's no free lunch on this one, and when you have to take care of patients, you got to figure out what that optimal hour is. And actually, a lot of stuff the research in this has come from pilots, where they say about 16 hours is really about the maximum that someone can sort of function and not make mistakes, which is a long time. But, and so when our residents were up 30 and 36 hours, no question, do I want a surgeon operating on me on the second day he's been up all night? Absolutely not. But I'm not sure I love his colleague who took over at midnight either. So, so it's just a little bit tricky to know what's the right thing. So go ahead, next slide. So why is stress bad for you? So stress is actually a good thing. The fight or flight response, the sympathetic nervous system, when you had to run from a bear, hundreds, thousands of years ago, you needed to get your heart rate up, to get your breathing up, to get your muscles twitching, to run faster. It's all good. So you need that sympathetic nervous system. The problem is when it's constantly revved. So in this state of stress, and especially in people who have heart failure, it's a terrible thing for people in heart failure, and it's why medications called beta blockers work so well. Metoprolol, atenolol, some of you have heard of them. These actually stop the sympathetic drive and slow the heart down. So they actually sound a little bit counterintuitive, but we work against the sympathetic nervous system. So just hit the next enter key, and I think you can go ahead and hit enter one more time. So I just put a little, and one more, and do all these things cause an increase in plaque or atherogenesis. That's where we're working on that, to see, is it actually causing plaque to build up, or more likely, I think what it does is it actually causes the plaque that people have in their arteries to rupture. And when plaque ruptures, that's when you have a heart attack. Okay, so next slide, please. So what is burnout? Burnout is actually a word. It's a term. It was, coined by Herbert Freudenberger in the 1970s, and it was really, he's an English psychologist, or no, actually he's a New York psychologist, but it was all about this sense of being completely burnt to your end. Next slide, please. And we think about it in medicine, and they actually have inventories that they can sort of figure out what is sort of the right amount of stress and who are being burnt out. And the things that really came up front is this emotional exhaustion and the depersonalization. So as soon as you start to feel like you just don't really care about what's happening to other people around you, that's a very bad sign that you are completely burnt out. Next slide. And that happens in my field more than you'd think, even in the trainees, where they're just like, I got to get out of here. I can't deal with this anymore. And so they go through degrees of it. This is what we're trained to look for, and you should be thinking about this when you see colleagues who you think might be burned out, or if you're starting to feel a little bit burnt out. And really, probably the second stage is really where it's, you got to help yourself or help others, when you're really starting to see a physical or an emotional deterioration, snapping at people, emotionally unstable and labile, breaking out and crying, weight gain, not eating well. Okay, next slide. And so this also comes from the InterHeart study, and just as an example of true numbers, there's about a twofold increase in heart attacks in people who said that they were chronically stressed at work and at home. And again, it went from a 5 to a 10%. This isn't like, oh my gosh, I'm stressed at work, I'm going to drop dead tomorrow. It's just more another thing that adds to what could be your problem and why you have a higher risk of heart disease. Next slide, please. And this is just more when it didn't matter where you lived, ethical groups anywhere in the world, the people who were stressed were always on the wrong side of the line. And then next, and this next one, I believe, go ahead, next slide. Oh no, sorry, go back one. Yeah, so this one was also about just association sort of with stress and job and everything, and again, all on the side of being worse for you. So then the next one, which I love this next slide because I have actually seen this happen in my commute. Yeah. So it wasn't exactly this, but if anyone drives on the east side of Manhattan, down the FDR on 96th Street going north, you get off, and I was driving to work one day, and sure enough, one big car had squished a little VW Rabbit into the side rail, trying to get past him going up the ramp. And I couldn't believe it. And then I saw this. I'm like, okay, so that's going to start your day very badly. So let's, yeah. And the people behind you, by the way, just so you know. So let's talk about anger and hostility. Next slide. So this I thought was a really interesting, very old study done on medical students. So 25 years after medical school, their risk, if they answered very high on this whole study of anxiety and hostility, if they got over a certain number, which was 14, they had a significantly higher risk of heart disease 25 years later. So, to me, that's the trait, that's the personality. This started this whole thing of this type A personality and type B. I'm not going to focus a lot on that because we're kind of going away a little bit from that anymore, because type A doesn't mean you're a hostile personality. Sometimes it can just mean you're aggressive in a good way. And so it doesn't always go with heart disease. So next slide. And so this is also just intense anger as a trigger of a heart attack within 1 to 2 hours of an intense emotional stress. There's a higher risk of heart disease. And this, I don't have the slide for it, but also within a few hours of natural disasters, earthquakes, fires also. But interestingly, there's some very interesting data on time of day. So for example, earthquakes, the San Francisco earthquakes in the last 50 years, Loma Linda, I believe, was in the middle of the night, sort of into the morning, and as people were waking up, a lot of heart attacks and strokes. The one, it was more in the 80s, and I just remember because there was a Yankee game on when it all happened, and in the middle, like later in the day, there was not nearly the same number of heart attacks after that one. So your circadian rhythm also has to do with it, and most heart attacks actually occur right in those wee hours of the morning because your body is waking itself up, and in doing that, your sympathetic nervous system is at its height, and you have more heart attacks. So
More of a surprise.
yeah, and your body's a little revved up, getting ready to wake up anyway, and so it just puts you over that edge. So next slide. So this is just as proof that the sort of Cardiology Society is starting to take this seriously. The JACC, it's called, the Journal of the American College of Cardiology, is probably the most respected cardiac journal, and it is starting to actually say, okay, this is real. Psychological stress and heart disease. So they looked at 25 studies. Anger and hostility was associated with an increased risk, and in 19 of those studies, it was actually also associated with a worse prognosis after you had it. Yes, hon?
When you're talking about just the
Yeah.
chronic anger and hostility, like someone who is very often in that kind of state.
Yes, but not even. It can be someone who's not always that way, but who has an enormous fight or something like that, or loses a spouse, loses a child, a lot of heart disease after, and there's actually something called Takotsubo cardiomyopathy, or sad heart syndrome. So after a tragedy, the heart actually kind of blows up, and people tend to get better, but it's after a huge emotional stress. There is an association of an anxiety or an anxious personality that goes with it. So I do believe the chronicity is important, but it can also just be that emotional stress.
So it was called toxic.
No, Takotsubo. It's a Japanese octopus pot, believe it or not, Takotsubo. So the Japanese octopus pot has a little neck and then a big barrel, so that when the octopus gets in there, it can't get out. And so that's what the heart looks like. It has a little neck, and then the whole heart blows up like a balloon. So it looks like an octopus pot. That's why they call it that. But Takotsubo. Yes, son? No way. Today?
Yes.
About stress? Yeah. So go get the New York Times. So it is absolutely real. It is much more common in postmenopausal women. Can recur. Like one of my patients, she blew out her left ventricle. She was a psychologist, and one of her patients threatened to kill her. And she got in her car and was very upset and drove home, had crushing chest pain, ended up in our ER, and had completely clean coronary arteries. No blockages, no nothing. So emotion is real, stress is real. You should all read that article. It's actually a fascinating constellation of events, and it's not just in women, but it's much more common in women. Okay, next. So let's talk about sleep now. So we'll talk a little bit about the kids now. So actually, and this became very popular, over the last sort of 30 years or so, and in Japan actually. So when the Japanese had a huge economic boom, and people were really getting overworked, and they actually named it karoshi, death from overwork. And so they found an association of a higher risk of heart disease in these people who are completely overworked. And you see that 37% only report getting about 8 hours of sleep now. And on average, we sleep about an hour and a half less than we did 100 years ago. And the more and more we're reading about it, I actually just bought a book. I don't know if anyone's read it. It's called, is it How or Why We Sleep? I think it's called Why We Sleep. And I've been recommended. I haven't read it yet, so I'll report back after it, but it's apparently all about, it's really not 6 to 8 hours of sleep. It's 7 to 8, and 8 probably ideal. More than 9, again, goes on that J curve where probably either depression or illness, and certainly less than 5 is incredibly bad for you and associated with all sorts of things. Now, we could do a whole other hour on sleep apnea. I'm not even talking about sleep apnea, which is, disordered breathing when you sleep, tends to be from a thick neck and you stop breathing. But I'm just talking about people who are chronically sleep deprived. And I'm not sure I'm really the right person to be talking about sleep deprivation, but it's why I'm trying to actually learn more about it, because I really do think it's important. Next slide. So why? Why do you think actually sleep deprivation causes a high risk? All of these things go into, they upregulate, or they actually downregulate melatonin excretion, which actually melatonin is extremely important in sleep. And then essentially you get this increase, and again, here comes that pesky sympathetic nervous system. So again, it's a little bit like steroids. Steroids help everything up front, but you never want to stay on chronic steroids, and so it's the same thing. You just don't want your sympathetic nervous system to be constantly revved up. And so then if you hit the button again for me, I think it's even one more. Go ahead, and then one more. And so this is, again, where I just sort of think about the sleep apnea compounding this also lack of sleep. Think about when you aren't breathing, the carbon dioxide level in your body starts to rise, and then you suddenly gasp for air. So think about how revved up you've got to be if you've got to sort of force yourself to breathe. And so if anyone has very disturbed sleep, I actually have them go for a full formal sleep study and make sure they don't have sleep apnea. Go ahead, next for me. So now the heart-mind connection, and this little fascinating part of the brain that we're finding on something called functional MRI. So functional MRI is just a really, really cool tool that looks at nerve conduction and metabolism in the brain. And so they actually have found the insula, which they know now, is sort of associated with visceral sensations, cold, heat, anger, itch, all the things that you don't really have a lot of control control over, and they would actually then put people in an MRI or an EEG, and for example, then have earphones on and have like a baby laughing and see what part of the brain lit up, or a baby crying, or something like that. And so they started to see where these parts of the brain light up. And so this is actually being used tremendously now in actually addiction medicine, in trying to get the addictive parts of the brain to stop craving heroin and craving all sorts of things. So next. But I bring it up because how does that connect to heart disease? And so now for the last couple of minutes of the talk, I'm going to talk about if you feel stressed, what can we do about it? So if there's anyone who are real meditators and trained in it, I'm going to apologize up front. I am an avid meditator. I do transcendental, but I'm not an expert. So chime in if you know more about this than I do. But sort of the two sort of very popular ways of meditating right now are mindfulness and TM. And the mindfulness, I think of a little bit more towards a Buddhist way of thinking, and it's all about judgment. And is this thought good for you? Is it helping your environment? And in order to find enlightenment and not have judgment, you have to get that before you can then be altruistic to others. And then TM thinks a little bit more about quieting the brain. They call it no thought. So, for you to either become enlightened or have no thought, I think that's probably hard to get from either side of it, but that's what we're all striving. And then if you can get the brain to sort of no thought, then again, it can open up to more altruism and goodness, not only for you, but for others. And so I like TM. Maybe it's the good Catholic girl in me growing up, and I watched my grandmother do the rosary. It's very methodical. It's very, I get my mantra and I just say it over and over. And so people who've done it, it just quiets the brain down. But I sometimes think, Mom, you'd see like Grandma, she would get a little trance-like when she would just sit there, and it was really a little bit more about just the repetitive nature of it. She probably wasn't thinking at all. So next slide. So go ahead and keep hitting them. I think that so this is just why mindfulness, it didn't come up, but so I wanted to just keep clicking through these because this is Brown, Time Magazine, keep going. All the famous people are doing TM. I don't know if you know that. Oprah's all doing it. It's so I just found all these things, even in school, so that's the last one there. But, leave it on that one. But you see, it's in the press now. Everybody's talking about meditation, and the Bronxville School has meditation classes. So I think it's good. And so, but I do want you to also know that it's not just because it's sort of popular. The reason that I'm also doing TM is because the American Heart Association actually endorses it, because there are some small but pretty good studies, and I'll show you them, that actually show that there is hard endpoints, heart attack and stroke in people who meditate or less. So next slide. This is just came out last year, 2017, and again, the American Heart Association, and they looked at all these different forms of meditation. Go ahead and put the next slide up. You certainly don't need to know these, and I'm happy to give anybody my slides if you want to look into these more, or that article, which is actually pretty easy to read if people want to read it. But mindfulness and TM, they did talk about, but they also talk about a metta meditation and a bunch of others. And really, essentially, the long and the short of the article is that they found a lot of good evidence that, certainly it was never going to hurt you, and that there was a positive attitude, there was a lot of positive change, but there weren't really a lot of hard endpoints, which we talked about. But next slide. But then I love this gentleman. So this is Ricard, I forget his last name, Moreau, I believe is his last name. It's down there. He's a French Buddhist monk, and he allowed himself to be EEG, so he had the EEG done and MRI'd while meditating. And they actually found some fascinating things in this gentleman's brain. And they actually called him, and it was in a New York Times article probably 8 or 9 years ago, about how they called him the happiest man in the world. So I love that. But what they found on this is that people who are avid meditators really did have changes in their brain structure, and this thing called neuroplasticity. And it's a very, very hot topic right now in neuropsychology and in, again, addiction medicine, on how can you form new connections in your brain. And you actually can form new connections, and they've proven it through meditation. Next slide. And so this is just some of the small studies. This was actually a study done on about 200 African American gentlemen that showed a lower risk of heart attack and stroke actually in meditators. Next. And we're going to go whip through some of these real quickly. This is their effect on blood pressure. So again, this is the meditators versus the non-meditators. Next. Trait anxiety. This was done on anxiety scales where they would answer questions. The only thing I can't remember about this one, and I apologize, these are very old studies. and on meta-analyses, you have to be very careful about, like, what was the placebo in it? Who were the meditators versus the non-meditators? So I'm always a little bit wary of these, but again, it never shows that the people who meditate do worse. If anything, they don't show something or they show a significant change. Next. This one I like because this was actually done at American University where my son goes to college. They did on coping mechanisms and in students, and so they had meditators, and in this study they actually did do kind of a meditative. The people who weren't taught TM were taught just sort of like a general meditation thing on an app or something, so at least they tried to control it, whereas when they actually learned TM, and this is why I try to tell people, whether it's mindfulness or TM or meta meditation, is actually go and really learn how to do it. I do think the apps are helpful, but I sometimes think that when you really learn it, you get much more out of it. Next slide. And this is just professional burnout. This was actually done, I think, in medical students. Next. And then drug and alcohol use, which I actually find interesting. So Alcoholics Anonymous is actually presently doing a study with the TM Center of the U.S. Because there's been some very interesting data that those who go to the AA meetings and get the social support and then who go home and also meditate actually do much better and have a higher rate of abstinence from alcohol. So, next. And then go ahead and hit them. There's just a few. I'm going to circle anxiety. You can just keep hitting so here, that's good. So this is actually not TM, but this is mindfulness. This was another meta-analysis where, essentially what you see here is most of it was more just insufficient. So it's not like it didn't have any good traits. It's just that the authors of the paper didn't feel there was enough data to, make a recommendation. But they did find moderate improvement in anxiety and depression and in pain, which I thought was interesting. So, and a lot of the people with post-traumatic stress disorder who feel that pain is a part of their disorder do very, very well with mindfulness-based cognitive therapy. Next. Okay, exercise, quick. So this is sort of, because a lot of people ask me, like, do I have to meditate? Why can't I just exercise? Totally fine. I think a lot of people find exercise very meditative. The runners, the swimmers especially. So let's see what we recommend. Next slide. So essentially what this slide shows us is that the best thing you can do is get off the couch. So going from being very sedentary to just walking a little bit decreases your risk 37%. And you see down to the 39%, a little bit more, very much levels off. Do marathoners live a little longer than us? Probably. But I don't know. Just because they are very, very slim usually. Usually the marathoning type attitude is that they also eat very well and have low heart disease. But in general, there is again a mild little J-shaped curve up for very, very avid exercisers, endurance athletes, marathoners, triathletes, Ironmen actually have a higher risk of something called atrial fibrillation, so the arrhythmia, and they do have a little bit more calcium in their arteries. So we're not quite sure why that is yet, but I would argue that 99% of my conversations are not about people doing too much exercise, it's about people doing too little. And so I would say that just walking, go next slide, and this is what they actually recommend. This is the American Heart Association's recommendation is 30 minutes of moderate intensity aerobic exercise at least 5 days a week for a total of 150 minutes. That's not that much, okay? And when we say moderate, severe, you don't need a heart rate monitor. You have to be what's called winded but not gasping. So you know how that feels. It's like you want to sort of be able to speak, but you don't want to just be strolling. Yes, hon?
Where does yoga fit into that?
I'm going to talk a little bit about yoga. The recommendations, interestingly enough, don't talk about yoga, unfortunately, just because the data comes from aerobic activity and actually mostly running. And I think that's probably because it's something that's easy to follow. Think about it. You run, you don't run, this is what you do. Yoga, actually, we look at a little bit more in like the meditative and the mindfulness stuff. So what is yoga good for? Yoga is absolutely going to be very good for the meditative state. It's going to be very good for falls and muscle toning and coordination. So especially as people age, I think that yoga and stretching is almost more important to prevent falls. So forget about the heart attack. You don't want to fall down the stairs and break your hip either. So I think that's really important. Did you have a question too, Ann?
I was just wondering if there are other kinds of physical activity besides
running or something. Next slide, please. See, you're like my mole in the audience. So, yeah. So people ask me, what are examples of things you can be doing? And so the two good things. One is that you don't actually have to do it all at once. If you can walk 10 minutes in the morning before work and 10 minutes at lunch and 10 minutes after, that's actually considered just as good. So keep that in mind. Gardening, aerobics, ballroom dancing, Zumba, you name it. So they all of these things, though, you see, they do get the heart rate up. That is the one thing that the American Heart Association is sort of clear about. For the heart, you actually do have to raise the heart rate. So depending on what kind of yoga you do, by the way, I find yoga difficult, and my heart rate is often very high in yoga. So I think you get the aerobics out of anything that increases your heart rate. So, yes,
I'm sorry. I wish it had vacuum.
it is. Can I tell you? Housework. Yeah, they do say.
There are things that we do that are strenuous.
I'm going to add that to honestly, vacuuming, especially upstairs, things like that. So anything, but remember, you do have to sustain it for a little bit and keep it going. I think that's why they like gardening. You know, people get out and get working in their garden, and they get really hot and sweaty, and it's hard, but it's enjoyable. And I love even like singles tennis, dancing classes, hiking. You know, go for a hike. Yeah, like on the weekends, I tend to. My poor doggy can't do it anymore because he's 15, but we'll take the dogs for a walk. But, you know, yes, walking poor Casey now is not aerobic enough. No, it's not exercise. But my friends have these younger dogs, and we really get these dogs going, and it's enjoyable, and you've got socialization. So that's why I don't feel like you have to go to a gym. And at the end of the talk, I'm going to talk about this little town in China where people live to be over 100. Nobody goes to a gym there, okay? So next slide. So this is just a silly slide, but I also wanted you to see how exercise can also combat burnout. And so people who are in very stressful jobs, these guys get it. Microsoft, Google, all these places, they all have gyms, they all have meditation rooms, they all have everything. Some of the cynics say it's just so they'll never leave the place, but you know, I mean, they do actually know that you have to give people a break and actually let them exercise, and they also have incredibly good cafeterias now, where it's like fresh salads, you know, all this great stuff. So next slide. So positive emotion. So what can we do except for exercise? So I'm going to teach you one little thing that actually, go ahead, next slide, that I worked with my fellows, and it's actually called 3 Good Things, and Brian Sexton is a psychologist actually at Duke, and he was asked to actually help the Duke Surgical Service because in the residency program at Duke, when he came there, the divorce rate was 110%. So even those people who got divorced and got remarried got divorced again. So it was horrible, and they thought it had a lot to do with the work hours and the burnout and the stress and everything. And so he started working with the residents. Go ahead, next slide. And the reason being is that I love this this quote from Barbara Friedrichsen. So the negative screams at you, but the positive only whispers. And that's a bit Darwinian. Think about it. You know, you're going to remember that noxious stimuli. You're going to remember the rattlesnake, you know, because if you didn't, the poor guy who couldn't hear the rattlesnake, guess what? He's not here anymore. Whereas those are the things that are hardwired into us to remember. But do you remember this beautiful day? We love it today, but are we going to remember it next week when the rain comes again? Like, unfortunately, the bad sticks with us. And so, next slide. If we can figure out how we can make the good, and this is a little exercise that you can all do, and I want you to try it, and the thing that's hardest about it is to do it for 2 full weeks, okay? I always get it to about 5 days in, and then I stop doing it, but 3 things, all you have to think about. 3 things that went well today, and what was my role in making it happen? That's it. 3 things. I got home in time to read my son a book. I opened the door for the little old lady at the supermarket. Whatever, like, you know, it doesn't have to be life-shattering. You know, you don't have to, you know, cure syphilis or do it, you know, things like that. You want to just do 3 little things, but you got to write them down, and you have to know your role in it. And then, believe it or not, you start to feel better about yourself. You really do. You're like, I did a good thing today, and it was all good. And then I find myself, I would do it, smiling, and then thinking, oh, wait, I had a better thing, but I already wrote my 3 down, so I saved it for the next night. Like, you know, you do. So you actually realize that you start doing really good things, and they're little things. But just think about it, and it's as good as like a first dose of Prozac. They actually found that when people did these inventories on a first dose of an antidepressant and people who did this, these people felt just as well or better. So yeah, so next slide. So the big thing is, so it improved self-awareness, awareness, mindfulness, purpose, self-care, relationships by day 4 or 5. And that's what starts to happen. You start to feel good and then you stop doing it. So keep it in mind, and if a little journal by your bed, write them down. And even if you're not doing it fully, write down good things. It's always it's something and then you can go back and look at it and say, I just went back and looked at it. I have my little journal by the bed and I laughed a little bit. It's like one day where, Serena, my oldest, she called me today. It was fun. So what was my role in that? Well, she actually likes to talk to her mother. It's a good thing, so things like that, just little things. So next slide. So these are just the clinical trials that demonstrate the benefits. So it, lowered burnout rate, improved work-life balance, we hope, less conflict at work, higher levels of happiness, and improved sleep quality. So remember, you got to do it for 2 weeks straight. So the next slide, it's actually this. This is actually where I learned about this. So I don't know if anyone knows Martin Seligman. So he is sort of the father of what we call positive psychology. And he first wrote a book on happiness and then wrote this one called Flourish, where the first half of the book, he negates the happiness part. He's like, it's not all about happiness. You have to have more than just happiness. You have to have purpose. You have to have a lot of things, and you need to sort of work at this. And I'm not quite ever finished with this book. I keep going back to it. So it's one of these books where you can sort of keep reading it. But he's the one that told me about the Brian Sexton and the well-being, and so I started it with my fellows. So it's kind of...
You say what's happening, just plain old.
Yeah, plain old feeling good, which is happiness, and that's part of it, but that's only part of flourishing. Flourishing is having purpose and having happiness and, and again, the sleep and doing all these things. And he talks about different personalities and how people are sort of, the real active people versus the quiet, and how you have to have both. And, so it's a really, really fascinating book. Next slide. And so this was a study done in Swedish men, which I found fascinating, and this is part of where that 80 to 90% risk reduction. If the men did all 5 of these things, had a healthy diet, which was on a point system, alcohol in moderation, which was less than 2 drinks for men, for women it's less than 1, no smoking, were physically active, again on a point scale, and had a healthy body weight, which is a body mass index of less than 25, and if you had all of those things, you had almost an 80% less risk of dying of heart disease. But how many did all of these things? Take a guess. And in general, it's actually the same in all studies. 20%, 5%, 1%? 2. Yeah. So 2%, unfortunately, got everything. And I thought about this, and Shona and my mom, okay, you guys can attest to it. Okay, I'm a healthy body weight, I'm physically active, I don't smoke. Alcohol in moderation, okay, maybe there's more than a drink a night on a lot of things, and I do eat a healthy diet, but because of the alcohol in there, I wouldn't have been in that top thing. So you had to do everything, and so that's why I'd say 80% of the time I have all 5. But look, I also have Pop-Tarts in my house. We got teenagers, so it happens, you can't eat perfectly all the time, and so that's why I say don't beat yourself up, but this is just sort of a goal to have all of these 5 things. All right, next slide. And this is from the American Heart, so they have the simple 7s, they call it, so the first 4 and the last 3, so the 4 health behaviors: non-smoking, healthy weight, healthy eating pattern, and appropriate levels of activity, and then the healthy factors: know your cholesterol, know your blood pressure, know your hemoglobin A1C levels. I would say 95% of my patients own a blood pressure cuff. They take their pressure at home. You absolutely cannot know your blood pressure from your doctor's office. It's useless. Yeah, most are too high, and it's called white coat, but there's actually something now called masked hypertension, where people's blood pressures are lower in their doctor's offices. Maybe they feel safe, whatever, and then they go to work, and they're completely stressed out, and their pressure's high. So I have people check it all times. Next. And this is just quickly to close on this book. So this was a fascinating talk given by Dr. John Day, who is an electrophysiologist. So electrophysiology is all the pacemakers, electrical stuff, the heart failure in the heart. And he was 40 pounds overweight. He had something called ankylosing spondylitis in his spine. He wasn't able to wear the lead anymore. He was thinking of retiring. He was a disaster. He was on meds for blood pressure. And he started to lecture in China, and he speaks fluent Chinese because his parents were missionaries. And so maybe because of that, people said, hey, have you heard of this little town? You should go there. So sure enough, he heads up to Bapan, China, and ended up going back like 5, 6, 7 summers in a row. Like, I don't know the details, but he went back every summer, took his whole family, and learned about this community. And so at any given time, 1 in 76 of them are over 100, whereas in the States, it's 1 in 4,000, and in Japan, it's 1 in 1,600. And so at the time, he said, so then enter for me one more time. So these were the 7 things that he learned from this community. So you can hit enter. There it is, good. So, what did he find? Eat real food, unprocessed, off the land. They essentially almost were vegetarian, but once a year ate pig for the new year, and that was it. And you have to see the pictures. You can actually see one of the women, if you can see it, they are carrying it up a hill, about 30 pounds of vegetables from, where they grew them and ate them that night. And then having a strong mindset, embracing aging and stress. China's been through a lot of stuff, and so they embraced the stress of their lives, and they didn't care about aging. They love aging. At 65, everybody gets a coffin. It's a tradition. And if you live to 75, you give it to someone else. And you live to 85, they're like, everyone's going to die. We get it. And then what they do is they tend to live to be very, very old. They get sick, and they're dead in 3 weeks. That's what you want, isn't it? And I tell everyone with my meds and all of this, I talk about, if I could say, okay, you're going to get to say 89 and drop dead on the 10th green, they're like, I'm in. But you just, unfortunately, nobody can do that. But this community pretty much does that. Think about it, there's no real medical care, too. So if they get cancer at 100, okay, and they just die of their cancer quickly. So it's actually fine, But all of this, I also like this socially connected. The 80-year-olds are babysitting for the great-grandchildren. They're doing tours in the town for everyone who wants to see why they live so long. This being in rhythm. It's more about circadian rhythms and having a nighttime and having meal times and getting together with family. Environmental programming, he called it. Clean air, clean water, clean food, no noise. I mean, they do live in the mountains in China. So, and that's all as they're getting popular and people are learning about them. Unfortunately, their noise is coming up, and they're getting more people invading. But I found this having purpose. Be supported. They all take in their elderly there. There's no nursing homes there, but when I was in China last year, it's a huge industry in China because of their one baby policy. Everybody's only got one child to take care, so the husbands tend to be working, and the poor wife is taking care of the husband and her parents. So it's a really, really tough way to live now, and so they're making all these sort of high-end nursing homes. But they'll see. It doesn't work as well. It really doesn't. So I just found it fascinating to listen to this guy. And the closest we probably have to this in the U.S. Are either the California Mormons or the Seventh-day Adventists, who are mostly vegetarian and vegan. Again, they have a real sense of purpose. They meet, religious organizations. I don't want to say religious isn't the right word. Like this organization, people coming together, having community, having purpose, doing community service. They live longer. They just do, And with the Mormons, too, they also don't drink alcohol. They eat very, very little sugar and sweets, So those are probably the closest we have in this country to seeing. And the Seventh-day Adventists have actually allowed them to be studied. And so they have groups in there. One are the vegetarians and the vegans, and then the pescatarians and the more Western eaters. And they can actually track their heart disease by how they eat. So that's another thing. So next slide, please, and we'll end on this, I think. I just said that Dr. Day is now off of all of his meds. He doesn't take anything now for blood pressure. So it actually changed his life. And so when I meet my patients, I spend about an hour with my new patients, and this is what we talk about. What is it, how much rest do you get? What do you do for enjoyment? What do you eat? What do you add if you want to? I'm not a huge supplement fan, but we talk a lot about supplements. A lot of us spend a ton of time at work. You better enjoy your work environment. What do you do to unwind on the weekends and at night? How active are you, and what do you do for enjoyment? This is all part of it. It's not just taking a statin for your cholesterol. And believe me, we talk a lot about that too. But I think you can't do it. And by the way, if people take every medicine that I give them for heart failure or heart disease, and they do everything else, but they don't stop smoking, it's as if they're not taking the meds. So that's probably one of the big things. And if you do stop smoking and refuse to take any of my meds or anything, you actually do pretty well. So, yeah. So thank you very much for your time. Yes.
How did John McCain do it? With all the torture, the physical thing, and the must have been extreme time.
Everything, yeah.
ongoing Stress, anxiety.
People ask me sometimes about him, and the other person I get asked a lot about is Winston Churchill, with 100 pounds overweight, with a cigar in his hand, and, lives to 93. Yeah, and he drank for breakfast, and catnapped through the war.
Yes.
All the things we swear. So you have to argue that, certainly for John McCain, his mindset was huge, and he had to have good genes. The genetics behind that's Winston Churchill, for whatever genetic quirk. And then I have a slide where I have Jim Fixx. Do you guys remember Jim Fixx, the runner, wrote the book of running and then drops dead running at 53. But people don't know, Jim Fixx also had lost 60 pounds, and he was not healthy before that. But same with the gentleman who, from The Biggest Loser, just had a huge heart attack, and he's got something called LP-little-a, lipoprotein-little-a. It was in the New York Times also. So there are genetic factors that unfortunately, are bad for some, but fortunately for others, actually do well. So these new medicines that are out, they're actually called PCSK9 inhibitors. Thankfully, most people don't need them, but very, very bad lipid disorders and things get on them when the statins either are not tolerated. But they found them by actually studying people who had incredibly low cholesterol levels and actually lived pretty long. And they're like, let's study those guys and see what it is. And sure enough, they were deficient in this one receptor. They made a little antibody against the receptor, and now they can give people. So we're not sure it's going to be as good as being born with it, but you see that when you're genetically gifted, you can just get through a lot. And I don't know, but I suspect John McCain had some kind of spiritual meditation, something. Like he had to have something to keep his brain from thinking that, especially during torture and war. Yes, Of course. Oh, I can talk about cholesterol for a really long time, so be careful. So cholesterol number in and of itself, total, I almost don't care about. People come to me, oh, my cholesterol's 240. I don't care about that. LDL, so cholesterol is what gunks up your arteries. They are carried on lipoproteins. So LDL, low density lipoprotein, HDL, high density lipoprotein, this LP-little-a, lipoprotein-little-a. So they're all lipoproteins, and they're carrying it around the body. LDL, in a very rudimentary form, brings the cholesterol into the body and is bad and gunks up everything. And it's dealt with in something in the liver called the LDL receptor. That's what the statins fight against. And the PCSK9 inhibitors. HDL, high density lipoprotein, is the good cholesterol. It kind of takes it out. And then there's the third part called triglycerides, and they're more linked to sugars and carbohydrates and prediabetes and metabolic syndrome. More and more now, people are starting to feel that HDL, the good one, is actually more of a marker of being genetically blessed, but it's not a modifiable risk factor. We have a lot of things that increase HDL, and they change the number, but they don't change the risk. What we do know is that when you lower that LDL, it absolutely drops your risk of heart disease. So, but however you want to do it, whether it's from lifestyle, and I have people who've gone vegan, and they've completely dropped their cholesterol. LDL cholesterol in your body comes from saturated fat in food more than anything. A little bit of cholesterol in food, about 20%, unless you're something called a hyperabsorber, and that's a whole other thing. But if you are a normal absorber of cholesterol and fat, it's saturated fat. And where does saturated fat come from? Anybody know? Animals. Animals in general. It's all animals. So there is no saturated fat in vegetables, essentially. Vegetables and fruit have fat, but poly and monounsaturated. So remember, avocados are fruit. They're not vegetables. But avocados and almonds are sort of the mono unsaturated in olive oil. And then the nuts, the cashews, the pistachios, Brazil nuts. Fattening, but good fat. Yes, then. I did. I love that movie.
That's what I asked up front about diet.
Esselstyn, and Caldwell Esselstyn is an endocrinologist who he believes not only in he's actually, I must say I respectfully disagree a little bit with Esselstyn on the fats, only because I do think that nuts and fruit that have the good fats are good for you, but he is militant, you know that.
Plant-based.
Yeah, but he doesn't do the oils either. Nothing. So he's
The point is that you reverse heart disease by
I do.
improving the diet.
I do.
Actually, he made the point in that film about that his colleagues, as part of
don't believe him. Yeah.
Colleagues, they'd rather do operations on people
And give statins and all this stuff, yeah.
He would rather change their diet and
So let me just tell you the practical side of that, is that if you're willing to fly out to Esselstyn in Iowa or wherever it is and go to his 10-hour course and you have bad heart disease, yeah, it can happen. But the practicality of my day-to-day is that that's very hard to do. So the other guy that does that diet is a guy named Dean Ornish. Do you guys know the Ornish? So Ornish and Esselstyn, and even the guy who wrote the China Project, Tim, I'm forgetting his name, but he's a researcher up at Cornell, and his son. So they're all what I call militant. They are no oils, no fats, no animal, nothing with a face. They're totally vegan. And then there's sort of the American Heart, who's much more Mediterranean. That's sort of, I call myself what I call pescatarian. I eat swimming fish. I eat some shellfish. But shellfish, again, shellfish and eggs are only going to be a problem for people who really absorb cholesterol. And I can test for that. You can actually see if you're an absorber or a producer. But if people are willing to go off that edge and go truly vegan, you will absolutely drop your cholesterol by tremendous amounts. Probably your HDL also, by the way, though. It tends to drop both. But yes, he has some proof that it does reverse. But I try not to stand up here and say you've got to do that. We do have medicines that help. I don't want to use that as the excuse to be able to eat poorly. Don't go to McDonald's and take my Lipitor. That's ridiculous. But I unfortunately have that crowd that does that too. But I think when people really do try, you can't eat this table. Life's too short, and it's just, so I feel like 80-20 rule, everything in moderation. So if you eat well 80% of the time, pick your battles. I laugh. I said there's no cheap cheese in my house now. It's triple cream brie or nothing. So honestly, it's like if I'm gonna eat cheese, it's gonna be really good, and I'm not gonna keep it in the house. So yeah. Yes, man.
Yeah, getting rid of stress, easier said than done.
Yes.
Sure. Now, healthy body, like if you do all these things and your body's healthy, is there evidence that stress could take out a healthy body? Like if you're fortified physically and you have deep emotional stress? Last week Bob gave a great talk on spirituality, and I've started to think about spirituality as this conversation that I've had with myself ever since I can remember, where I'm just trying to plug into this greater human experience. And I come to identify that that's the source of a lot of my stress as well. This kind of quest for spirituality. There's all kinds of things that rub up against it and make you feel like you don't plug in, like you're not there, like you're falling short, like, all these things.
You never get anything finished, and you never
finish, like all these kinds of things. And I try to be healthy, I'm aware of everything, and I'm aware of like my purpose in life. I have 3 small children that kind of keep me waking up in the morning and appreciate the fact that I have a job and all this kind of stuff. But yeah, you think about, like I'm an old dad and I'm an illness with raising my children, all this kind of stuff, it just stress creeps in, So at what point do you say exercise, I think, is sometimes it's better in that it derails the conversation in my head.
Yeah, and that's why a lot of people find exercise very meditative, and then you can't think about it. And that's why I actually think exercisers do. So do you ask me, does stress negate, sort of everything else? No, of course not, but it's not helping, and you know that. We all know that. And, as I say, everything is tragic at 3 a.m, and so it disturbs your sleep, it disturbs everything, but I can't erase the stress in our lives. I can't erase my stress. I have found that mindfulness, or, the meditation, and then bio and neurofeedback have been incredibly helpful, but there's no panacea. You know that. As much as I'd like to say I've got this, great, I wake up, my mom knows I'm sort of going through a career change and everything. I literally, if I tell you, didn't sleep 2 days last week completely. I know I did. You have to sleep, but you swear you've watched that clock every single hour. And so as much as I'd love to get up here and say, if you do everything I just told you, it'll all be good, it's just not possible. But you're doing it. You're doing everything you can do here. But I would say that don't use sleep aids, by the way. I'm not an Ambien fan. I'm not, I just feel like anything you can do to stay away from things like Ambien, because those are really mind altering. But, there's going to be an incredible realm of evidence in the next 10 years, by the way, on CBD and THC, just so you know. So the chemicals that are in marijuana. So CBD is the non-mind-altering part of it. It's in oils now. You can get it over the counter. I actually have some. It's good for sleep. It's good, but it's an oil, you know. And then the THC, though, at least in New York, still requires the prescription for it. But it's incredibly good for chronic pain, and it is getting much, much more accepted, I guess is the right word, not only amongst the medical community, but amongst the politicians and lay community. And so the CBD specifically, because it's not mind-altering, you know, it's just oil. It's something, and then the other things are some of the anti-inflammatories that I think are incredibly good, turmeric, curcumin. So if we can get them into a form that are actually micronized and they can be absorbed, I think they're going to be really helpful. But again, are they going to negate that you wake up stressing out in the middle of the night? Probably not, you know, but these are all things that I think are in our future for stress management. Yes?
One of the things I've noticed is good water and air quality. What do you do about that? And there's
I mean, other than move to Wisconsin, or no? Yeah, like, yeah.
political climate we're in.
Yeah.
It's not very
No, yeah.
priority.
Well, and you know what
It's going in every-
I think our air quality actually here is better than it used to be, you know, especially in some of the big cities. It's still pretty bad in places like China and you know, the big cities. But for me, it's almost more the light and noise that we have control over. So getting rid of the devices at night, closing your shades, getting it, you know, have like a wake-up lamp maybe, you know, to wake you up at the right time, and just getting the noise out. I think we as individuals have control over that. You're right. What are the politicians doing about water quality and air quality? I don't have a lot of control over that, but I think individually, we really do have control. You know, we had a big fight in Bronxville over putting lights on our field, and, you know, I got accused of all sorts of nasty things for wanting to have lights so that we could play till 8 o'clock at night. And people tried to argue with me that I was going to screw up their kids' melatonin levels. And I got up in front of the school board and I said, it's not screwing up melatonin levels any more than their phone sitting next to them until 11 o'clock at night is, you know. And no one had an answer for that, you know. And so I think individually, yeah, do I want to live next to the field that's got the lights on all night? No. I get it, you know, and even though we say it was going to be down at 8 o'clock, you know, the creep, I think that was what they were worried about, is like at 11 o'clock at night, they got lights, you know, out their back door. But individually, my kids, I'm sure your kids, they got those phones in the bed with them, like in the bed. And that's, yeah, right, so keep it in mind. Go, okay, yes, all right. Maybe one more. Okay.
We're talking about stress, and I sometimes try to figure out whether I'm feeling stressed or not. How do you define stress? Is it just heart pressure, blood pressure?
Yeah.
What do you define as?
It's a really good question. You know, what is stress, and what stress is different to different people. My stress, my anxiety is kind of a pit feeling in my stomach, almost on nausea, low-grade headache, inability to concentrate. So that's my stress, but some...
Indicators rather than measurements.
Yeah.
Indicators of how one feels rather
Yeah,
than...
it's all about how you feel. And like I said, some people would think what I'm doing and they could never do it. It's too stressful. Others are like, it's nothing. You know, so that's why it's a problem in judging stress. Stress is different to different people.
No, you had a question. Hiding back.
I was going to ask whether you had any opinion about the literature of fasting.
Oh, yeah, that's a really good question. Fasting, so 16 hours of fasting at night, or a week fasting, or religious fasting, you know, so communities who fast have less heart disease. They really do. And so there's quite a bit of literature actually in the Alzheimer's disease world too, that a 16-hour fast at night is very good for brain metabolism. So I actually try to fast 12 hours every night. I don't eat, you know, whatever hour I finish eating, I don't eat till at least 12 hours the next day. and that would include a glass of wine or anything like sugary, that you're doing. So, if I take a glass of wine up and write my notes at night till, say, 9 o'clock, I don't eat anything until at least 10 the next day. So I don't know yet. I think the literature is preliminary, but there is a lot being touted about fasting and it's sort of increasing brain metabolism. As far as heart disease and fasting, it's a little bit harder to say because it kind of depends on what you eat in between, So if you fast 12 hours but then, go to McDonald's for lunch, that's not going to do you any good. So it's really more for me about what you ingest as far as heart disease. But clearly for brain metabolism, people are very interested in fasting. Yep. All right. Thank you.
Will's going to give us some good vibes. Studied the Dalai Lama's monks who have been meditating for 30 and 40 years and found significant differences in their brain patterns. It's very, very interesting. However, my favorite anecdote is a conversation he had before the study started. One of the monks said, "Professor Davidson, will these EEG leads you're putting onto my brain have any effect on my energy body?" And Davidson said, being a good scientist, he said, "I do not know." And that monk opted out of the study. However, the other monks had some interesting questions as well, and I'm trying to remember this as quickly and well as I can. One of the monks said, "But Professor Davidson, there are only 25 of us. If one of us is really unusual, wouldn't that make your results look funny?" So he was talking about the statistical outlier. Now, these are people who've never been to college, didn't have statistics 101. A second one said something like, "You're only studying Buddhist monks. What about ordinary Tibetans?" He's asking about the control group. And the third one said, again, there are only 25 of us, asking about the end. So you don't have to be a Western, especially Western scientist, the bigotry about the science being a Western imposition, to be an intelligent person. And it was a fascinating series of questions that these, quote, uneducated Buddhist monks were asking Professor Davidson. He's a very, very interesting neuropsychologist. Yes.
Yeah,
Yep.
but I know that was interesting.
Yep.
We're thinking about our brain, but it's really all about what's in here. It's,
Right.
I remember one of them said, "Oh,
Right.
And the two are connected.
Speaking of which, my closing words are from a physician, Albert Schweitzer. The basis of good is that it preserves life and favors life and wants to carry life to its highest value. And that the bad consists of destroying life, of wounding life, of hampering life's chances. The principle of this veneration of life is like the principle of love, as discovered by religion and philosophy, seeking to understand the basis of what is good. The term respect of life has more latitude and is by that more tame than love, but it carries within it the same energies. By the respect of life, we become religious in a simple way, profound and living. So let's respect life and enjoy Maggie's snacks. Thanks very much. Thank you, Erica.